So in this video, I want to take you through a fantastic functional exercise that doubles as a screening test that's really good at picking up where your handbrakes might be to peak performance, or what you might be missing that might be setting you up for pain or injury now or in the future. And that exercise is the overhead squat. Now, what makes the overhead squat such a brilliant screening test for a lot of people and a lot of different activities is that it encompasses a broad spectrum of joints and tissues throughout the body. And what the overhead squat allows us to do is it allows us to see how you move in real time, zero in on a part of your body that may not look perfect in the moment, and lead us to further investigate that area in terms of your range of motion, your strength, your muscle control, your tissue quality, to look for clues as to what might be causing you suboptimal performance or setting you up for pain and injury in the short term or long term. So before we get to the specifics of how to do an overhead squat correctly and the standards that I want you to set for picking holes in your mechanics, it's really important that you can grab a broomstick and your phone, find a clear area to work in, and just practice a few overhead squats without any coaching or prompting. In this way, we'll get a really clear and natural look at how you are moving before we introduce the standards that we want you to strive for and really compare yourself up against. So when setting the standard for an ideal overhead squat from which to compare yourself to, we want to look over a broad number of areas. The first of which is your foot placement. So being barefoot, ideally we want your feet about shoulder width apart and pointing straight forwards. On top of that, by rotating your knees outwards, you'll be engaging your hip musculature, putting your hip and ankle into a stable position so that your knee is able to hinge backwards and forwards in a linear plane. From a shoulder perspective, we want to make sure that with the bar above your head, that you are externally rotating your arms and shoulders so that your elbows are almost rotating backwards to again create that external rotation force at your shoulders to create the most stability and strength at that shoulder joint. From a trunk perspective, we ideally want your trunk to translate up and down in the same linear plane from which you started. And when reaching the bottom position of the squat, your low back should not round and create a butt wink or have that back sort of tuck in underneath those hips. And by having these really clear standards of what an ideal overhead squat should look like, we can measure up how you feel and look doing this and have a very clear understanding of where you might be missing good function and good performance. So it's important to note that what's become clear to me watching myself back doing this video is that my overhead squat technique isn't perfect. I'd like to think that I'm pretty good considering some of the issues that I've had previously in my life. But the standard that I would like to set for you specifically is that if you can match my technique in terms of mobility and strength and control, or your technique looks better than how I'm doing it, then it's fair to say that you're pretty good functionally. So when getting down to the bottom of your overhead squat position, if you feel that you need to widen your stance at all, if you feel like you have to turn your feet out for any reason, if you feel like your heels come up off the ground for any reason, or if you feel or see that your knee begins to track inwards, differentiating itself from the original line that it was moving in the first place, then that might suggest that your ankles are stiff in some way. Moving up to the hips, again, if you feel like your knee does start to cave inwards or deviate inwards at any point throughout that exercise, then it may suggest that your hip is lacking some mobility, strength, or muscle control. Similar to this, if as you're getting down to the bottom position of the squat, you do see that your lower back rounds or your hips sort of tuck in underneath your bottom, then that may suggest that you're lacking some hip flexion or some broader hip range of motion as well. And moving up higher through the squat, if you feel like the angle that your trunk is positioned tends to lean forwards a little bit more than when you started, again, that may suggest that you are lacking some hip range of motion. It may suggest that you're lacking some back range of motion. And finally, moving up to the shoulders, if you don't feel you can keep your arms back and you feel like that bar is coming forwards, or you're losing that connection and that stability, that external rotation of the shoulder, then it suggests there's something going on at your shoulder that needs further investigation. So once you get a really clear understanding of how your overhead squat looks compared to my overhead squat, then we can start to have a really exciting series of conversations about how much better you can actually be. So if you are an athlete or someone who needs to compete or perform day in, day out, or are you just someone who wants to get better at a chosen pursuit that you have, even if you don't have pain, but you have these clear dysfunctions present with your overhead squat, Once we can start to address those dysfunctions, we don't know how much better you can be, how much more we can optimize your performance. So you might find that just by removing a hidden ankle stiffness or a hidden hip restriction, by improving your shoulder mobility or your thoracic mobility, you might start to gain more strength, more power, more accuracy with your skills, more endurance, more function you didn't realize that you have left on the table for however long. So the overhead squat is a fantastic way to see these things in real time, give you some guidance as to where you need to focus on, give you something to focus on, and then come back and see how much better you can perform. So if you are someone who has a fantastic overhead squat technique, then that is a really great stepping stone to optimizing your function. Obviously, the next step up from that is to begin to challenge you with load. So maybe adding a bar with some weights on it, and then slowly increasing that weight until we start to see where your cracks might be. So it goes without saying that the overhead squat is a brilliant self-assessment and screening tool, as well as a great functional exercise to incorporate into your day-to-day life. With that being said, I look forward to seeing how you look doing your overhead squats, and we'll see you in the next one.